I had just come from MTV, where the average age was 28, and went to NBC, which was GE, where the average age was 55, and people were just waiting for their pensions to kick in. So it was a bit of a cultural adjustment for me. I also went over there without a specific, there hadn't been somebody in this position before. It was a brand new position. And so it really needed to be defined. And I'm not even sure that they knew what the position was. They just talked to me and decided they wanted to hire me, so they did. And I found over time that they weren't really sure what to do with me, and so I really had to define that space for myself. And one of the ways that I was able to do that was with the help of Annie Brown and Kelly.
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples. Not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz. Real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
Why is my next guest different from all other guests I've had on How I've Made It in Marketing so far? Well, it's one of the reasons why I was so glad to see her podcast guest application and invited her on. It's not because she's an academic. We've had other academics on before. It's because I would describe her as someone who critiques our industry. Now, your first visceral reaction may be, how dare she? And Daniel, why on earth would you prominently amplify her voice? Fair enough. After all, as Upton Sinclair said, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. So if that's your feeling, this episode is just not for you. But this is the way I think about it. I want to do my job with eyes wide open. Of course, we in the marketing industry stumble, even when our intentions are noble. We need to learn from it. And when we work for our brands, if we do not do right by our customers, another brand will come along. If we do not do right by our customers as an industry, someone else will step in. Just look at the discussions in Congress right now around data. So you may be able to get away with those tricks and hacks in the short term, but it tends to catch up to you. To use another great quote, as Dr. Martin Luther King famously said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I think the same is true for marketing, which is why we specifically don't teach marketing hacks and tricks on Marketing Sherpa. We sit down with marketing leaders, discuss the most powerful stories from their career, how they've wrestled with these decisions, made mistakes and learned from them, and ultimately better served the customer and achieved business results. And that is the conversation we will have right now with our next guest. All that said, she's not here to teach any critique specifically. She's here to share her own very unique lived experience in the marketing industry and what she's learned on her path from being a marketing director just like you to ultimately moving into academia. She can share from a unique perspective, a bird's eye view of the industry, if you will, because she is no longer bogged down by day-to-day clients' concerns. But she says she is still sympathetic to what it's like to be a marketer. So it's my pleasure right now to welcome Dr. Mara Einstein, Professor of Media Studies at Queens College. Thanks for being here, Mara.
Thank you so much for having me. And let me also add to this. I may critique marketing, but I am also the biggest fan of really good marketing. If you do something that is really powerful and moves people in a positive direction, I will applaud you from here to the ends of the earth.
Here, here. I love that. And that's a challenge. And that's why we have this podcast. On this podcast, you'll see the discussion tab. We don't have any of the good ideas, right? We say from our experience and stuff, but we can spur and hopefully inspire someone listening right now to get that next great idea, do that great marketing, and maybe you'll see it and cheer them on, right?
Absolutely.
So let's quickly look at your background so people know who I'm talking to. Started majoring in theater at Boston University, went on to get an MBA in marketing from Northwestern, then a PhD in media from NYU. You were the Director of Advertising and Marketing Communications at VH1, a Director of Marketing at NBC. You've written 6 books, most recently Black Ops Advertising, Native Ads, Content Marketing, and the Covert World of the Digital Cell. And for the past 23 years, you've been a Professor of Media Studies at Queens College, part of the City University of New York system, where you just launched an advertising major. So tell us, what is it like? What's your day like as a Professor of Media Studies?
It can really vary. I mean, one of the things I really love about being a professor is that your life sort of changes every 4 years when you start writing a new book. And so your life becomes immersed in what it is you're studying at that particular period of time. But if it's a day when I'm teaching, I usually teach work for 3 hours in the morning. And then I spend the afternoon in a couple of hours in office hours with students. And then if it's a writing day, I get up and write in the morning. And then I spend the afternoon doing interviews with people. So right now I'm working on a new book. It's not all about MLMs, but it's partially about multi-level marketing. So I'm spending the morning writing about how people get enmeshed into multi-level marketing. And then I spend the afternoons either interviewing people or finding people who I want to interview who are either working on the marketing side of that or are additional people who have been a consultant or whatever, or stylist or whatever they call it, depending upon what MLM it is.
Let me tell you, when you're researching and writing like that, so I found one of the biggest challenges always to get in the shoes of the marketer. So did you actually try to go and like purchase from MLM companies, or did you get deep into this, native content when you were doing this? Because I found, as marketers, when I'm creating something, when I'm writing something, or when I'm working in that boardroom and everyone's on the same page, it seems to make so much sense. But then when you put on the shoes of the marketer and you see it from that perspective, that's the biggest challenge. And you're like, wait a minute. So have you actually gone and now are you buying from MLM companies to see what that customer experience is like?
I haven't done that yet, but what I have done is hired one of my former students to become a consultant.
Okay.
And so I can see, because I'm of a certain age and don't have the same sort of facility with social media as my students have. And so I've hired a student to become a consultant and to see what kind of pushback she starts to get in terms of, oh, you need to work harder, oh, you need to sell more, oh, you need to buy more, and see what happens to her in that respect. But there has been there's been a lot of good work. A guy by the name of Bill Keep did a conference on multi-level marketing, and it's just terrific if anybody's interested in that. And it's both a combination of academics, people from the FTC were there, former MLMers. It was the whole shebang. It was really incredibly well done.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's jump into, like we said, the stories, what you've learned from your industry, which goes way beyond MLM to all types of marketing. So you were an account executive at an ad agency, BSB, and there you learned always vet the talent. How did you learn this lesson?
That was when I worked on Miller Lite, and I was actually the only woman working on Miller Lite at the time. And let me tell you, that's battle training for a woman in the industry. But one of the last commercial that I worked on there was a commercial called Football Wives. And if people know the Miller Lite brand, they know that sports talent was used over many, many years to sell the brand. And it had never been done with anything other than the sports talent. And if the sports talent was in the commercial, then the talent people would vet them, right? Make sure that they weren't an alcoholic, though I think there was an issue with Billy Martin and people just overlooked that. And that wasn't the case when we did it with the wives. And so I hadn't worked on the prep for the ad. They just sent me down to Florida, which was nice. It was 1 week down in Florida at a nice resort, and we were shooting an ad with 4 wives. And the women were walking ahead of me the day before the shoot, and I was walking behind them with the producer, and we heard one of the women say to one of the other women that she was pregnant. Now, the last thing you want to have happen is to have somebody find out you've shot a commercial for an alcoholic beverage with a pregnant woman.
Right.
So the producer and I do the equivalent of a spit take and look at each other and say, okay, that's not good. And then we say, oh, I wonder if anybody's vetted the other women in this. And it turns out one of the other wives, her husband had been picked up, I think, on 13 DWIs.
Oh, wow.
And so he obviously had some sort of a drinking issue. So we called to New York and we were like, okay, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And so we were trying to shoot it in such a way as to have the two women that would ultimately need to be cut out of the ad on one side and the other two on the other side. So we didn't really tell them they were going to get cut out. The commercial was shot. We brought it back to New York. The head of the agency, I think it was a guy's name, Bob Lenz at the time, was like the head creative guy was trying to cut the spot. I don't think it actually ever ended up being able to be cut appropriately, and they had to junk the whole thing. And I think, which doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but back then it was like $350,000 down the tubes.
Yeah, better to figure that out before you start shooting, right? But at least you might have saved them from a public relations nightmare.
Absolutely.
When I hear about vetting, I think some place that companies and brands could also get in a little bit of trouble is with their channel selection. So I was wondering, and I think this gets to your last book, how well brands are vetting their channels. So on an earlier episode, I interviewed a CEO named Chad Brown, and he launched Virgin Hotels Las Vegas right in the middle of COVID. And he had limits on what he could do with talent and channels. And his lesson was that have a Gumby attitude, right? In other words, always be flexible. So I was thinking of that in your discussion of vetting talent. And I wonder what your thoughts are on vetting channels and tactics. And, because sometimes marketers use this excuse, everyone's doing it. I feel like I have to use this channel or this tactic because everyone else is. But that flexibility lesson in your vetting lesson, it's a good reminder to all of us that there's always another option. That's the thing of creativity. It's not just creativity in the ad. It's creativity in our channels or tactics. If we're worried about how these might reflect on our brands, we just have to find another way. So what have you learned about brands vetting their channels and their marketing tactics they used?
Well, the question makes me have two thoughts. The first thing I thought of was sleeping giants, right? And these were the folks that went after advertisers shortly after Trump came out, and they found out that a lot of name brand advertisers were on Breitbart, for instance, and most people didn't know that they were there, mostly because of programmatic ad buying, right? Because nobody had set up the program to say, no, we don't want to be on this. And
so let me just interrupt you real quick so we're clear. When you say most people didn't know they were on there, you're not talking about most consumers. You're talking about the marketers of the brands themselves didn't even know they were advertising on Breitbart because with programmatic advertising, they're not picking a buy on a specific channel.
Correct. Okay, because what happens with programmatic, right, is that you're looking for the eyeballs. You're looking for the eyeballs based on a specific demographic, and you don't care about what the content is anymore. That's one of the real major downsides of programmatic, and some of what I talk about in Black Ops. You can't just let the technology do this for you. And I think that's really one of the downsides of not having a person in the system somewhere, because, way back in the old days, we looked at where every ad ran, made sure that it ran where it was supposed to run, and all of those sorts of things. And now it's all allowed to go by the programming without any kind of consideration about the environment within which your ad is being seen. I don't think you want to do that as a marketer. It's not helpful to you as a marketer to be next to Breitbart or to be next to OAN or whatever it is where your ad might end up. So that's one thing about vetting. The other thing I started thinking about vetting in terms of talent is really influencers. The influencer that's really cool today could be a real problem tomorrow. And everybody wants to be an influencer, and now you have the influencer networks where you don't have oftentimes the same sort of ability to be able to vet the talent in the way that you want to be able to. Take the extra time up front in the same way you would want to take the extra time up front to vet the talent for a commercial. You want to take the extra time up front to vet the talent for your influencers, because not every influencer is created equal. And especially now when marketers are looking to use more nano influencers as opposed to the big celebrity influencers. And I think that's right. I think nano influencers, the ability to be able to connect people, is a much better use of the technology. It is about making those connections. And if somebody has a feeling and a connection with a particular influencer, they will be more likely to connect to your brand and trust them if if they suggest that your brand is something that their listeners or followers should buy. But if you're talking about an influencer with a smaller following base, they also probably are somebody who needs to be vetted more carefully.
Yeah, I love that. Like I tried to say in the opening, is be careful for the hacks and the tips and the tricks. We see these all over the web. And what happens is we as marketers, we own that message. We own that how the brand is perceived. And the brand is perceived by more than just what we say. It's how we say it. So I love what you said there. So this is a very practical next piece of advice for any manager or above. Tell the anyone in college now who's interested in going into marketing, tell the interns when they aren't doing the job, you're not going to do them any favors. So tell us about your experience with interns, how you got burned, how you decided to, I got to make sure these interns know that they need to help me out or I'm not helping them out.
Right. I ended up being the internship director at Queens College for 15 years after I left corporate. And part of the reason why is because I'd hired and fired an awful lot of interns over that time. And the example that I like to give to students about what to do and what not to do was 2 interns that I had at NBC toward the end of my tenure there. I had one intern that we were trying to make the argument that if a music label put their talent onto the Today Show, that they would see a spike in sales. And so we were working with SoundScan, and I taught her how to use SoundScan. And it got to the point where the producers out in California were calling her instead of calling me. So she was taking work off my plate, which is what's supposed to happen. You train somebody, and then they're able to take it on, and they can take ownership of that piece of work. I had another intern who I had asked to do an expense report for me. This was before we did it all on computers. And so I had given her my receipts, and I had been out to Burbank, because when you work for NBC, you go out to Burbank once a month. And she just left it on her desk, and left it on her desk, and left it on her desk. And it got to the point where the billing department was asking me where the expense report was. I thought she'd already done it, frankly. And I went in and I found it on her desk. And it turns out they charged me, the company charged me because I was too late in getting the expense report in. So I always say to my students, you want to be the first intern and not the second intern.
Yeah, and I think there's a great lesson there for personal branding too. So for internships, for sure, for any job, one of the reasons you get an internship, you get college credit, you're, hopefully learning, but you're also starting to build your personal brand and network within the industry. And you want to build a personal brand where someone, because you always get asked after, would you refer this person? You want someone that is going to say, oh, I've had this great experience, that personal brand has grown. So I think that's a great lesson there. Actually, it brings up another question about personal branding. I want to ask about your name now that I think about it. So Dr. Einstein, right? I don't know if that's something that you were born with or came to later in life, but I've noticed something, with my name, for example, Daniel Burstein. So when I was young, when I was a kid, I did not love the name Daniel Burstein because Berenstain Bears, nobody knows what Daniel Burstein is. I wanted to be Mike Smith or something. I was jealous of those guys. But now that I've grown in my career, and especially publishing and stuff, it's great to be Daniel Burstein because, there is a Dan Burstein and a Danny Burstein. That's why I specifically go by Daniel. But, people can find me. There's a brand out there. And anytime I'm working with the Mike Smiths or the Jane Smiths, it's really usually hard to find them on social media. So one lesson I've learned is if you're Mike Smith, be Mike Billingsmith or, be Jane Ann Smith or, so someone could actually find you. So I just wonder, with such a unique name, Dr. Einstein, there's both a compliment, right? Someone would say, oh, Dr. Einstein. It's also kind of backhanded compliment, like, oh, what a Dr. Einstein. So just where, how has that brand affected your career?
Well, I married into the name.
Okay.
My maiden name was Schwartz. And I actually divorced my first husband, but I decided to keep the last name because really Schwartz or Einstein, that's really not a fair fight in terms of the decision making there. It's really interesting that you say that. I'm in the middle of a personal rebrand right now.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's so funny. This is so great that you're asking this question. So one of the hardest things for anyone to do is their personal branding. Even as a marketer, it is so hard to do. And so I've spent the last 2 months really thinking through, okay, I'm going to redo my website. I'm going to do all this stuff. Okay, what am I going to do? So the first thing that I did was change my internet handles to the Dr. Einstein.
Nice.
Dr. Einstein was gone, so I had to go with the Dr. Einstein, but I actually like it. The Dr. Einstein. I'm also about to launch a new newsletter called Marketing Straight Talk. It's not really for the industry. It's more could be for people in the industry, but it's more for a general audience to understand how marketing, what marketers do, how marketing affects us, could be anything from MLMs to I've also done work on marketing higher education. I've done work on influencers and so on. So I'm digging the Dr. Einstein these days.
It was cool. I love it because fun fact: the actor Albert Brooks was actually Albert Einstein. That was his birthday.
He's related.
Rebranded.
Yeah, no, he's related. Yeah.
That's very cool. I think that's a great lesson for anyone with a unique name. I love how you leaned into it. I've seen Sally Hogshead talk before. We had her out at the Marketing Sherpa Summit. Just gave a great talk about the same thing. Kind of when she was younger, that name was not really something beneficial. But if you've ever seen her brand, she's heavily leaned into Hogshead and talks about what the Hogshead name is branding. Yeah. And it's memorable. And then you remember Sally Hogshead. So anyone out there, if you've got a unique name, like Dr. Einstein, lean into it. If you've got a very common name, find a way to make it unique. Put in a middle name. Do something else there so, people will remember your personal brand.
Just so you know, Danny Bernstein is a graduate of Queens College.
Is he really? Yeah. So for those who are listening don't know, Danny Bernstein is actually a Broadway star. He's in Fiddler on the Roof. I think he's in a French play.
He was in Moulin Rouge.
Moulin Rouge, that's what it is. And so every now and then on Twitter, someone will congratulate me for being such a wonderful Fievel the previous night and me with them. But again, that's where it gets to. The minor thing I did is Dan Bernstein is actually a published author and a VC guy and, well known. And Danny Bernstein is the actor. So I make sure colloquially, if I'm talking to someone, I don't care if I'm Dan or whatever, but if I'm publishing or if I'm doing something like this, it's Daniel Bernstein. So I've got kind of that unique name, that unique brand, that unique value proposition we all want, and someone can find me, and they don't think I'm going to, show up and do a great If I Were a Rich Man, because I would not. I would mangle it. Speaking of which, this is perfect for our next lesson. Details matter. So the details in your name, for your name, for your personal branding matter. Details matter for other things. I love this because this is a great example, as I was telling Mara in the beginning. We're not looking for thought leaders, not looking for people talking about the same thing. Details matter. You hear that everywhere. But she has a great story. She was working for VH1, the VH1 Honors Award Show, the first award shows. She had incredible talent there, Stevie Wonder, Bonnie Raitt, Prince. Tell us, how did you live that details matter?
Well, I won't take all the credit for this. I actually have to give the credit to our creative director, and her name is Sherry Dorr, and she is just brilliant. Sherry Dorr is brilliant, and she's still working in the business now. What she decided to do for the award show, and VH1 created VH1 Honors as the kind of response to the VMAs, right? MTV had the VMAs, and we know from a ratings perspective, you can really game up the ratings by having an award show. So we did this award show, and rather than give like a Moon Man, which is what MTV gives for their awards, was to create individual sort of tableau for the talent, and they were all specific to what the talent was, and they all had a glass front on them, except for the one for Stevie Wonder. The one for Stevie Wonder didn't have a glass piece on it, and I remember there was a face in it, and I don't remember what the other pieces were, but the front part of it was open so that he could feel what the parts were to the award that he was receiving. And it was that kind of attention to detail that made the difference between just giving something away and really giving something memorable to talent who then feels like they want to give back to you.
No, I love that. That's beautiful. And if anyone just happens to be younger or is unfamiliar with Stevie Wonder is a famous singer. He was blind. He couldn't see. So being able to feel that is beautiful. And it got me thinking that detail is great for your talent. but what details matter when it comes to the customer's brand experience, right? What are the small details companies are overlooking? So one example that comes to mind for me, we have a free digital marketing course, and in FAST class number 11, Flint McLaughlin teaches, remember that the customer is the subject and your offer is the object. And as an example, he shows a test with a company that had the headline, "We can help you lower your payments by up to 50%. And simply by changing a small detail, you change it to lower your payments by up to 50%. They got an 88% conversion increase. So I just wondered, what have you come across in your experience or in your research, Mara? What details matter when it comes to the customer's brand experience? What are the small details that companies are overlooking?
The first thing I thought of was a terrible experience I had, because that's also really key, is what consumers remember is the terrible experiences they have.
Sure.
They don't remember the good experiences they have quite as much. Can I name the company? Is that okay?
That's
for
up
a
to you.
bad
You're totally
experience.
welcome to.
I bought a new iPhone at the Verizon store. And of course, the guy upsold me to get a watch. And I then went online and saw that they were charging me all kinds of stuff for the watch. He ended up charging me for insurance that I specifically told him I didn't want. It was like one thing after another, after another, after another. I was like, seriously? And it was 3 phone calls later and all this kind of stuff. And I returned the watch because I said, no, I'm done. I went to the store. The guy gave me his phone number. He sort of patted me on the head. Really not the way to deal with this. When I called them back again, there was somebody who got on the phone with me. She was able to help me maneuver my way through some of all this stuff. And then she said to me, I can give you $25 off a month. I said, really? I said, just this month? She goes, no, for the life of your contract. I said, really? I was like, okay, I'll take it. But I didn't understand why it took me complaining so many times and having to have such a bad experience to begin with to get to the point where that was going to happen. And I think that that's something that it left such a bad taste in my mouth. I'm not sure that when this contract is done that I would stay.
Well, I think the lesson to that for me, one, first of all, what you said is great about, a negative experience rests more with a customer than a positive experience. We've actually done research with 2,400 customers. We asked them both about positive and negative experiences they had with a company. And it turns out to be very likely to work with a company again, you need like a 5 out of 5, basically. I'm simplifying it. But to be very unlikely to work with a company again, a 3 out of 5 in experience, you'd start losing customers. So it wasn't 1 out of 5 and 5 out of 5. It was the positive, you needed a 5 out of 5. Just at 3 out of 5 with the customers, they're starting to leave. And the thing that your story really gets me thinking is, I don't know. I don't blame the individual you're working with. I blame the incentive scheme that they came up with at Verizon, because likely what happened is, hey, they're looking for, like a lot of companies are, we need to just boost that revenue in the next quarter. Let's give some spiffs to our salespeople. We get some of those extra things in there that really are very high margin because they don't cost us anything. Then, we're going to be able to kind of boost some of that revenue. But as I said in the beginning, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Is over time, you're going to burn and lose customers that way, and someone else is going to come in that's going to serve them better. And I know personally, when I've had those experiences and they burn me, I'm always like, fool me once, shame on me. But I am never getting burned by that company again. I'm going to find another way. And I'm not as good as you sometimes and reach out. And because not every customer is going to be like, Mara, and reach out. A lot of customers, I'll just think, okay, I'm not getting burned again. I'm not dealing with them again.
One thing I would say, and I have a good example because I don't want to come off as negative, so I want to give you the good example. But the other place I would say that this is more of a consumer announcement is going into drugstores, and the drugstore telling you that the price for your prescription is a certain amount, and then you say, well, do you have a coupon? And they come back and tell you you don't know anything. I mean, that's something that I don't feel like consumers have to do, but that's a longer conversation, and I'm much more complex. Good story, wonderful story. There's a company called Life Therapy, and they make really wonderful smelling lotions and all of this sort of thing. And I've bought from them a couple of times, and one time I actually gave a bottle away to a friend as a gift, and she opened the bottle in front of me, and it had already opened, and the soap was all over the place. And so I just sent them an email, and I said, I was really kind of embarrassed because I gave this to my friend, and fell apart. And they couldn't have been nicer. And she said, oh, we check everything before it goes out. We feel really terrible about this. Don't worry, we'll ship something to you right away. Not only did she ship it to me right away, she had a handwritten note in there saying, we really stand behind our product. We are so sorry this happened to you. Here, take this. And then she included a couple of samples. I have, not surprisingly, ordered from them multiple times since.
That's great. I think it actually ties well into our next lesson, which you say, be nice. So you were working on the Uncle Ben's account. Where was this? Was this at the same?
This was at Backer Spielvogel Bates, BSB, and so when I worked on Uncle Ben's, I'm embarrassed to say I work on Uncle Ben's. Nobody likes Uncle Ben's anymore. But we always did a side-by-side comparison of the rice. And there was always one side that was the sticky rice and one side that was the rice that was floating in the air. And so I get a call from somebody in traffic saying, you need to come down to the bullpen. And so I go down to the artist bullpen, and this is in a day when people used X-Acto knives to pull stuff up off of a piece of paper.
I remember.
Right? And he said, take a look at this. It's like, okay. He had to teach me. Take a look at this. I was like, oh, I was just shocked because the separated rice was under the competitor and the clumpy rice was underneath Uncle Ben's. And so we were able to switch it before it went out to the magazine. But I think the reason why he called me was that I used to go down to the bullpen and hang out with the guys and the women who worked down there. And I would say, do you want coffee? Or I would bring homemade brownies or whatever it was. And that puts, I didn't do it to put money in the bank. I did it because that's who I am. And artists are really fun people and I like to hang out with them. So, it was, I think, that I treated them like people and not quote unquote hands, which is what we used to call them. They weren't hands, they were people, and they're people who were doing their job and working hard. And we were all there at 8:00 at night trying to get this ad out. And they saved me.
That's great. On an earlier episode of the How I Made It in Marketing podcast, I interviewed Paul Krasinski, and he told the story. I'm a big fan of Pearl Jam. Not just because I like their music a lot, but also because of the way they run their business. Like they're very well known for treating everyone very well. Not have the old rock star attitude in the '80s was tear everything apart and act like a jerk and everything. And he told this story actually, because he's brothers of John Krasinski, how he got invited to be backstage with Pearl Jam and hang out with them. And after the show, even, this big show at Fenway Park, they were hanging out with Eddie Vedder backstage, and then how, they things did after show. And he got to see up front, he's like, this guy, because I hate seeing people's LinkedIn now, marketing rock star, right? I hate that. And he said, this guy is literally a rock star. He had just rocked out Fenway Park. And I saw how he treated everyone, these people backstage who no one would ever know, some fans, who like children and stuff, and to me, it's such a reminder and inspiration. Once we move up in our marketing career, we get egos, we're a marketing director, we're a CMO, we have a podcast, whatever it is, we have these egos to remember that all of these people involved in making this thing happen, maybe if you're at the top of the org chart or you're a bit of the face of something, you feel more important than them, but it doesn't happen without that collaboration with everyone pulling it off. So having that attitude of, I'm not a rock star. Again, a great quote from Eddie Vedder. He once was asked, what's it like to be a rock star? He said, it's such a weird thing. He's like, I don't want to think of myself as a rock star music. I want to think of myself as a plumber of rock stars. I always said that was just such a great way to go about it. We're all just plumbers. We're all just trying to fix those pipes and get everything done at the end of the day.
Well, I want to give a shout out to one of my colleagues whose people may or may not know, I think they probably do, is Douglas Rushkoff. He's written an awful lot of books. He's written, he was the one who created the term media virus, throwing rocks at the Google bus. Present Tense, I think, is one of his books. He's got a new book that's coming out shortly. But he's just salt of the earth. I mean, he's had, I don't know how many New York Times bestsellers. He's done frontline documentaries. He's got, graphic novels he's written. I mean, he has every reason to feel like he's better than everybody else, and he never does. And he is willing to help anybody. He will help people you know, in so many ways. And I often look to him as my sort of North Star about how to treat people.
I think that's beautiful. I think, one, if you're just 100% cynical listening and you're like, I could care less about anyone else, but you care about marketing success, I think you're probably going to be a lot more likely to be successful if you see everyone's role in what you're trying to create. But I think, too, not to get too deep, but there's going to be a time when these marketing careers are over, when these academic careers are over. You know what I mean? It's all going to be over at some point, and we're going to be lying in a bed, hospital bed somewhere, looking in a mirror, whatever. And I would like to know that, okay, I've had maybe, hopefully, I hope, a slightly more positive impact in people's life than a negative one. And so, well, let me ask you, I want to ask you about this be nice lesson when it comes to customers. So you gave a good example before about being nice to customers in general, how a company was rewarding you. But when it comes to media and content specifically, I wonder how brands can essentially be nicer to their customers. And I think about it for this reason. We take a very content-forward approach with Marketing Sherpa, with MechLabs Institute. And something I notice in content, and this is maybe where I'm cynical, I see there's a lot of content out there. It's written for keywords, or it's written for an algorithm, or it's like, how can we just get it placed everywhere and put like a trick headline under some native content with a platform and get people pulled in. And, for us, I feel like, and this is maybe tooting our own horn too much, but I feel like it is an honor and a pleasure to be able to serve people with our content. And so being nice is critical to what we do. And I was looking back at, for example, one headline I wrote when we were asking our audience what topics they wanted us to cover. I said, this blog post will not solve your most pressing marketing challenges yet. And so I could have written a headline that hopefully oversold it, clickbait, got people in these things. But we really try to make that honest promise and serve people. And so I wonder, especially in your research, like, how can brands be nicer to their customers when it comes to how they're using their content?
Well, it's interesting, because I told you I'm working on this personal branding stuff. And one of the things I learned from that course is that 70% of your content should be content that is helping your customer, right? What are things that would interest them? What are things that would entertain them? What are things that they don't know that they kind of need to know? I think that was one of the things that Casper kind of did really interestingly when they had their blog. It was really a combination of sleep, but it was also, the Girl Scouts went to the White House on a sleepover with Michelle Obama, so that's, it's kind of fun entertainment that they can have. But only 10% of your content should be some kind of a hardcore sales pitch. 20% of your content can be, other things that you don't want to post about your competitors, but you might want to alert your consumers to, what's the latest news from, I don't know, the FDA about, your suntan lotion. I don't know, I'm making this up off the top of my head. But it's not, content is not about you. And that's the difference between content and advertising.
Yes.
Content is not about you. Advertising is all about you. And people don't want advertising 24/7. They want content, and they want, that's why they call it customer relationship marketing. It's creating a relationship. And you can't create a relationship when you're constantly saying to someone, buy something from me. I'm really fabulous. Buy something from me. Who wants to hear that 24/7?
Yeah, we actually interviewed the CMO of Sattva, which is also one of the early pioneering direct-to-consumer mattress companies, on an earlier episode of the How I Made It in Marketing podcast. And one of the things he said is, programmatically, we were talking about programmatic before. Programmatic got us so far, but then we realized the brand became important at some point, especially as some of that programmatic stuff became so expensive. And one of the things they did is they got into content, and they partnered with Time Magazine and Time Publishing. And one of their all-time best performing blog posts was just something helpful regarding sleep. It was helping people. It wasn't just so much, hey, buy our mattress. Our mattress is 10% better than the other mattress, right?
Right.
All right, well, here's another great lesson I love. Know when to quit. You were the director of marketing at NBC, and this one shocks me. So you said when you don't care if Jerry Seinfeld shows up for the upfront meetings, you realize it's time to quit. So this shocks me on two levels. One, I'm a huge Jerry Seinfeld fan. But two, at this time, I'm guessing this was the late 90s, Jerry Seinfeld, biggest star in the world, I think, biggest show on TV, not just then, ever. And one of the lessons we had earlier in an earlier episode of the podcast, I don't remember exactly who gave it, but they said, hey, remember that marketing's fun. Like, these jobs are fun. Look around you and realize you're doing something neat and fun. And I realized that's a good lesson. We had Marketing Sherpa Summits. We had these big events. Very stressful when you're doing a live event. Is a talent going to show up? What's the next thing that's going to happen? What's going to go wrong? You're solving problems. And it was sometimes, hey, stop and look around. We're at the Aria in Las Vegas. This is kind of fun. You kind of forget that. But you're saying you were at the point, Jerry Seinfeld's there, you could care less. You knew you had to quit. So take us back to that.
Okay. So I worked at NBC for 5 years. And there's particularly when you're working in network television, there's a very specific pattern to your year. So you launch the shows in September, and you hope everything that you created is really wonderful. And if it's not, you have to adjust. And then in January, you get into pilot season, and that's when producers are creating all kinds of shows. You have meetings with producers before then to say, we know we're going to have an 8 o'clock hole that we need a comedy, or we're going to have a 10 o'clock slot on Wednesday when we're going to need a drama. And so they start putting things together. And so then you have pilot season. So the pilots start being created, and then sort of January to March, you're watching the pilots, and then in March, you have the development meetings. And the development meetings are meetings that used to happen in LA, and I think since they're happening in New York, but you would fly out the top advertisers to meet with the top programming people so that they could tell the advertisers what shows they expected to be on the schedule in the coming year. So that's March. You keep working to put everything together, and then you have the upfronts in May, right? So the third week of May, everybody presents their programming to the advertisers, and those were huge events, right? They were either at Radio City Music Hall or Avery Fisher Hall. All the talent shows up. After that, then you present the same stuff to your affiliates. And then after that, you do the Television Critics Association pressers in Pasadena. And so it was every year it was the same. And after 5 years of that, it was just like, Mama's getting tired. and it was a lot of the same. It felt very the same. It felt incredibly routine. It felt like the scripts were all kind of the same. And it was the last year I was there was the year, it was shortly after where you may or may not remember that the financial interest and syndication rules had been dropped. And so suddenly networks could own the content that appeared on their air. And so that was when the Paramount Network was created and the Warner Brothers Network was created, because these guys were producers of primetime television shows. And so they were going to create their own outlets and provide the programming. So all of a sudden, the existing networks were like, oh no, what are we going to do? All of a sudden, ER is going to go to the Warner Brothers Network, and what are we going to do with our lineup? So the network was throwing tons and tons of money, and it was reported that they were paying $11 million an episode for ER that year. And NBC was doing the same thing with Jerry Seinfeld. And so I remember that last year, it was when GE owned NBC, and Bob Wright was sending the GE plane to go pick up Jerry Seinfeld, and it was figuring out, is he going to show up? Is he not going to show up? Are we going to actually have him in the lineup? How much money is the network going to have to throw at him, and all this kind of stuff? And I just went, I don't know. I just don't know. And what's really funny too is I went to undergraduate school with Jason Alexander.
Oh wow!
So I knew Jay, but the lips were sealed about what was going on. I think he did end up staying after that, but I just went, you know what? It's time for me to go.
Well, ironically, Jerry Seinfeld, maybe one of the most famous graduates of Queens College, and then what made you feel like, okay? So I mean, it's one thing to say, I'm going to leave NBC and go to another network or something else in the entertainment industry. It's another thing to say, I'm going to leave NBC, I'm going to stay in marketing. work for another company, work for a brand, a consumer packaged good brand. It's quite another thing to say, I'm not only going to leave NBC, I'm going to leave the marketing industry. I am going to become a university professor. So how did you make that drastic of a change?
Two things. For those of you who are looking for a new career, there is a wonderful book called I Could Do Whatever I Want If Only I Knew What It Was by Barbara Scher. And unlike something like what color is your parachute, it doesn't ask you what kind of job you want to have. It asks you what you want your life to look like. And it took me about 6 months of doing the exercises in the book, but what I ultimately got to was I was still an actress. I really like to read. I like to do research. And I can write. And so I was like, okay, I guess maybe I'm a professor. So, at that time, when I was at NBC, I was getting my PhD for the last several years when I was there. And I studied with Neil Postman, who wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death and Technopoly, which are books that still stand the test of time. Actually, Ezra Klein just talked about Neil Postman on his most recent podcast. So Neil is having a revival, as it were. And so I went back to school and studied with Neil and knew that it was time to go. That was one part of it. The other was that I knew for myself I needed to do something that was intellectually a bit more stimulating. I also, not that look, I worked with some of the smartest marketers on the planet at MTV. So I'm not saying marketers aren't smart. Don't think that that's what I'm saying. I just knew for me I needed something that was a little more intense on an intellectual perspective. And I just lost my thought about what the other thing I was going to say.
To make this drastic change to say, I want to move from, working in the marketing industry to working in academia. I wonder, was there any bit toward like the mentoring part? You mentioned
I know what it was.
People that chance to kind of bring up the next generation.
Some of it was that I was seeing a lot of the research at NBC, and I was seeing a lot of the research about how people were unhappy. So that made me start thinking about, is getting people to watch more television the best use of my energy on the planet? And that's really what got me thinking that it was time to go. I also wanted to write. I really wanted to write books that were going to help people. I didn't go to be an academic to sit in an ivory tower. I became an academic because I really wanted to write books that would help people navigate through a consumer culture. And the book I'm working on right now is a really personal one for me because it's both a combination of how marketing works, but also how persuasive technology works and how that is ratcheting up our anxiety in the economy. And we're starting to see how that starts to play out for people. I was a single mother for about 10 years, and I saw how that impacted my daughter, particularly as it related to trying to get into college. And, just a real quick story about that. So really smart kid, last name's Einstein. She actually has the blood. I don't, she does, right? But she failed the physics Regents exam in New York, which is like a running joke in the family that an Einstein would flunk the physics exam. But she went to Bronx Science, really big, important high school in New York that's known for, graduating a bunch of Nobel Prize folks in science and whatever. She applied to colleges. She got into one. She was in the 99th percentile in her board scores. So we have no idea why all this happened. She reapplied later and as a transfer student and got into 10 out of 12 schools. the system's busted, but the system is busted at the expense of the sanity of our children. And it's a lot of marketing that's going on to play on the anxiety of parents. And marketing in higher education is not that old. I mean, some of us remember View books from when we went to college. But now what has happened is that folks that used to work at Pottery Barn are now CMOs at colleges. So they're taking that consumer learning and using it on vulnerable, anxious adolescents. And I just think it's wrong.
Well, thanks for sharing. I mean, I think one that's a great lesson for we're going through what some people call the Great Resignation now. So for anyone interested in a job switch, I think it's great always, thanks for sharing your story, to hear from others how they went through that job switch. You went through this many years ago. But also, too, kind of hitting home that point of the messages we put out in the world, and that's where I kind of said earlier, it's not just we're marketing, we're looking to hit certain numbers, certain revenue. The messages we put out in the world have an effect on people. So there's two things. Long term, I think, and from some of what the research shows, when you have a more positive effect on people, you will be more successful. But also, as you said, the things you do with your life, the things you do with your career have a real effect on real people, and keep that in mind when you're marketing. I want to talk now about lessons from some of the people you collaborated with. You called out Leslie Schaefer. She was the Senior VP of Marketing at VH1. And this was a nice positive impact she had in your career, as we can all internally on each other. You said, help push people to believe they can do more than they think they can. So how did Leslie do that for you?
Leslie was one of the first people to ever be hired at MTV. She was like one of the first MTVers. So she'd been around there forever. And I was first hired as a marketing manager. And it's interesting, even my interview story, because she interviewed me. I came in to interview with her, and she was very distracted. And she called me up about a week later, and she said, "You know what? I didn't give you your due. Can you come in and chat with me again? I was in the middle of budgets, and I was really distracted. And I know there's something there, but I didn't quite get it the first time. Can you come in and talk to me again?" And I said, "Sure." And I came in and I got the job. And then about a year later, they did a massive restructuring at MTV. And what had existed at the time was that there was a centralized art department, so that if any of the networks needed artwork done, you went down to the art department, and they assigned someone to you. And they decided to do a restructuring to have the creative people actually in the individual networks. And that did make a whole lot more sense, because you didn't have to go through explaining what the network marketing strategies and tactics were at any given point in time, because the creative people were already part of the department. They already knew what was going on. So it was a lot more sense. So Leslie had made it so that I was promoted to director, and I oversaw the creative group within VH1, while also continuing to be the client to the outside advertising agency. And I was like, "Oh my God, really? You think I could do this?" And she's like, "You can do this. You can absolutely do this." And it was the first time that I felt really supported by a boss, and also being pushed to do something that I wasn't sure I could do, but I took on her trust in me to be able to do this job and to do it well.
So I think that's a great lesson for managers, to kind of find those things in our people and raise them up even when they can't see it themselves. But I wonder, is there any advice you give to your students or former students, or really any advice to employees of like, how can they communicate that to managers, that, hey, maybe you think I can't do this yet, but I can? And so one piece of research that always really stuck with me, we had Michael Norton, who's a professor at Harvard Business School. We had him speak at our events before. And some of his consumer behavior research, which I loved, he calls it trust through transparency. And he showed that when you can actually see the work happen, you value it more. And he has a lot of research. But one story he always gave that stuck with me is he talks about a locksmith. He said he interviewed this locksmith, and when the locksmith was just starting out, he wasn't very good. And so he'd show up at someone's house, they were locked out. It took him an hour. He was like banging and knocking everything, and he's sweating, and he's like, he's just like wrestling with this door, and finally breaks it down. And, he's like, and then, he'd say, "Hey, $200, whatever, and people would say, hey, sure, here you go. Thanks so much. But then when he got better in his career, he got more, deeper into his career, he'd show up, he'd think here and there, or take 2 minutes, and he'd say, your door's open, $200. And people would be like, what am I paying you for? And he said, the great irony is the second experience is better than the first one. It was quicker. There was no damage, but people were more likely to value the second experience higher. And that's because, again, we value what we see. When we can see the work, we value it higher. And so I wonder, you ever get advice to your students, your ex-students, who feel like they're just struggling in an organization, their managers aren't noticing them? How can they communicate that value to do what that manager is able to do for you? Say, hey, I'm able to take this next step in my career.
I think that the one thing that I say to students, certainly to interns, is certain companies have a very structured internship program. And so there are certain advertising agencies, for instance, that they put the students 1 week in one department throughout the course of the summer. So the students know exactly what they're going to do. There's other places that hire interns and then they're sort of like not sure what to do with them. And so we always tell the students to be proactive. And if they find themselves at any point sitting around, that they should go into their boss's office and say, what can I do to help lighten the load for you? Is there something you can give me? Is there a meeting I can sit in? If you don't have something for me, can I go talk to Susie over there because I know that she needs help with XYZ? But to never be sitting, and to, particularly in an internship opportunity, and to constantly be asking to learn, even if it's, what are you reading right now that is helping you do your job? So that I know that I can read that too, so I can learn about how to be better at this.
I think that proactivity is a great lesson. I mean, I've seen it with interns, I've seen it with, employees, but they're more junior, that kind of had this feeling. So I think in school, when you come out of school, the professor, you start the quarter, you got the syllabus, the professor's telling you exactly what to do, exactly what they expect of you, how you're going to be graded and all these things. And then you get into many organizations and, usually organizations are hiring because they're growing. They're growing fast. They need help. You know what I mean? They're not. So some are structured well, but some of them, it's not as clear of a structure, how you're going to get judged, what needs to happen. Right. And so I definitely noticed some junior employees who just sit back and wait to be told what to do versus those people who are jumping in and saying, how can I help? What can I do? What can I learn? So that's a great attitude and lesson to have always.
Well, that's one of the things that I do in my upper level courses. So my lower level courses, yes, it's much more structured. But when we get to the upper level courses and students are seniors, they're still looking for rubrics. And because I teach in CUNY, a lot of the students come out of the New York City school system. So they're used to somebody giving them a rubric to do everything. And so by the time they get to a 300 level course, I don't give them a rubric. And they'll be like, well, what do you want, Professor Einstein? What do you want, Dr. Einstein? And I'll be like, no, you need to think through what you think I'm asking you, because by the time you leave here, a boss is not going to do that for you. You need to start thinking it through yourself to figure out what you think the person needs. They'll tell you if you're wrong, and I'll tell you if you're wrong. And this is a place to learn, so you can do that. And nobody expects you to step out of college and be able to do everything right away. But think through what you think it is, because that's the most important part of the process.
I love that. There are no rubrics in life. There are no rubrics in life, right? I love that. I've always felt like standardized tests have driven us wrong. I was very fortunate as a student that I would just happen to do good in standardized tests. But a standardized test, it's A, B, C, D. There's 4 options. Mm-hmm. I have almost never in my career had something so simple where there's 4 options. There's unlimited options. You don't know where to take it. And you don't know where to drive it. So that's perfect. All right, let me ask you about one last story here. We talked about people you collaborated with. You called out Anne Brown and Kelly Coogan Swanson, who worked with you at NBC. And you said there are people who have your back at the place you work. And I assume there are people who have your back when you build those relationships, right?
Yes.
So tell us about that story.
Yes. Well, when I worked at NBC, I mean, it was still very much a boys' club. You have to imagine, this is mid-1990s, I guess. And I had just come from MTV, where the average age was 28. Mm-hmm. And went to NBC, which was GE, where the average age was 55, and people were just waiting for their pensions to kick in. So it was a bit of a cultural adjustment for me. I also went over there without a specific there hadn't been somebody in this position before. It was a brand new position, and so it really needed to be defined. And I'm not even sure that they knew what the position was. They just talked to me and decided they wanted to hire me, so they did. And I found over time that they weren't really sure what to do with me, and so I really had to define that space for myself. And one of the ways that I was able to do that was with the help of Annie Brown and Kelly. Anne did a lot of the advertiser deals with NBC, and Kelly worked on the affiliate marketing side. And so the three of us would sit around in the morning. This is when you go into the office, and you go into the office at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you talk about your kids, and you sit over coffee, and you have your muffins, and you talk about what's going on with your day, how you can maneuver some of the political issues that were going on. At that point, the guys in our department were getting stock options and the women weren't. But it was only because of, talking with each other and being able to pull our own strings that we were able to find out that some of these kinds of things were going on. So I think it's really important to find out who your posse is. I also think this is the downside of not going into the office. There is something about being in physical space with people that is very different than being over a Zoom, and not just that, but I tell my students all the time. When I was in advertising, we took our clients out. Our clients were always outside of New York, and I'm thinking about my Dole clients. We're coming in from California. They'd come from California. We'd take them out to dinner. We'd get them all drunk. You talk about your kids, you talk about your family, you talk about what you're going to do for the weekend, whatever it is, and you make that personal connection so that when you present to them the next day, they think of you as a person. They know who you are as a person. And so it becomes a much more comfortable space to live in. I understand not going back to work 5 days a week, but I would certainly push for 3 days a week so that you can sit down with your quote unquote girlfriends and make sure that you're covering each other's back.
And I think what a great follow-up, too, to what we just talked about. There are no rubrics in life. Figuring out, with kind of your posse, as you call them, figuring out, okay, how are we going to navigate this very complex situation where things are kind of tricky? And you know what? Things aren't always fair. They're not always doing the right thing. How are we going to navigate that? That school's not like that, hopefully. So, all right, well, great. We covered so much territory. We talked about properly vetting. We talked about so many things. If you had to break it down, if you had to talk directly to the audience, what would you tell them? What are the key qualities of an effective marketer?
I mean, the first thing that came to mind was stay curious, really stay curious. And particularly now when there are so many new ways to look at things and to engage with people. That would be one thing. The other thing, and this is my bugaboo, digital is a tactic. It's not a strategy. It is one thing in your bag of tricks. Maybe it's becoming a bigger and bigger thing in your bag of tricks. But don't think that that's the be-all and end-all of everything that you could possibly do with consumers. There's 360-degree touch points with your consumers. Think of them as people. Interact with them as people. As David Ogilvy said, the consumer isn't stupid. She's your wife. And so treat, not just your wife, your husband and significant other, and all of those people. But bottom line, we're people, and we want to be treated with respect. And I think that's the most important thing to bear in mind.
Well, thank you, Mara. I've learned so much from you in this conversation. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great fun. Loved it.
Good. And I hope it was fun for everyone listening as well. So thanks to you all for joining us.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketingsherpa.com.